like the Avalon that are so dedicated to their viewers and their community members, and I'm honored to be an honorary part. I came from Baltimore. I still live in Baltimore, but it's nice to be an honorary member of your community for tonight. And I just want to plug, since we're plugging, we're taking screen time away from two fabulous movies that if you haven't seen them, you need to see. Woman at War, right? Which is so germane to what Alicia and I are going to be talking about later. And then the wonderful Never Look Away. Magnificent films. So I want to thank both those movies for giving us their space tonight, and encourage you, if you haven't seen them yet, to please check them out in this beautiful space. But now I have the extreme, profound pleasure of introducing my friend, Alicia Malone. Alicia is passionate about classic films, independent movies, and supporting women in film. In September 2015, she gave a TEDx talk on the lack of women in movies and why that needs to change. Her first book, Backwards and in Heels, about the past, present, and future for women in Hollywood, was released in August 2017, and her most recent book, The Female Gaze, Essential Movies Made by Women, was released in November 2018 and is available in all major bookstores. Previously, Alicia has served as the host of the dearly departed film Struck, Turner's streaming service for movie lovers, and she was the host-creator of the Fandango series Indie Movie Guide. She's appeared as a film expert on CNN, Access Hollywood, E! Entertainment Tonight, and many, many more. And oh, wait, I left out MSNBC. MSNBC. But to me, Alicia is, I think you have attained a national treasure status for your work on TCM and the brilliant work you do in introducing movies on that channel. We were chatting earlier and I said, you know, you are such a great film scholar, and Alicia sort of demurred and said, well, I'm not a scholar. Well, I'm here to tell you, Alicia Malone, I think, is one of our most important film scholars in terms of bridging history and theory and deep knowledge of cinematic grammar and cinema's past to a popular and large audience. It's crucial bridge work that she performs with grace and with style and with deep wisdom. So we're so lucky to have her here tonight. Join me in welcoming Alicia Malone.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi. I am so honored to be here in this beautiful theater. As Anne said, it truly feels like a cathedral, particularly with this mural that I see above me, a whole shrine to film. And it's my first time here in DC. So tomorrow I'm going to get around and see as many things as I can in one day. I'm really looking forward to it. But I'm so floored by Anne's lovely words because I've been such a fan of hers for such a long time. And she's incredible. Been reading her work for a long time, and I do bristle at the word scholar just because I am self-taught. You know, I grew up in Canberra, Australia, which is the capital of Australia, but it feels like a very small town. And I dreamed of big things in Hollywood. I escaped through my love of classic cinema, and I tried to learn as much as I could. You know, as a really fun kid, I would just stay in and watch movies and read film books rather than go to parties, which I still do, by the way. But I had a dream of moving to Hollywood and one day getting to talk about classic film, and I knew that I learnt better on the job, so I didn't go to university, but I just self-taught myself as much as possible. And I moved over to LA 8 years ago, and I turned on Turner Classic Movies because it made me feel less homesick. I could watch these classic films and it reminded me of growing up as a kid. And so one day I got out my little goal book and I wrote down at the very top, one day I want to work with TCM. And I had no idea how that would happen, but somehow it did, and now I am living the true dream job. And you know, I get nervous at these events, but I'm so excited that I get the opportunity to talk about women in film, because even when I started talking about the subject just a couple of years ago, it was very taboo, particularly the places that I started speaking out about it, which was on these YouTube channels that were run by men, that were very male dominated. And we had to talk a lot about comic book movies and very popular things, so I always tried to pivot to indie films and classic films and talk about women in film. And the comments I would get as soon as I started mentioning, you know, 4% of women, you know, direct these top grossing studio films every year, maybe we should have more. I get, you know, feminazi, you're too politically correct, you're a social justice warrior, which I thought sounded really great. It turns out it's not supposed to be a compliment, but I thought, yeah, I'm a warrior for social justice. That sounds incredible. I don't mind that at all. But, you know, that's something that I've had to deal with now. I've been on camera for 12 years, and I've been on the internet as well for a long time. I think I've been on Twitter now for 10 years. So I can tell you that I've heard every single thing about every part of my body and that you could imagine. Good and bad, indifferent, and you know, on my best days, it doesn't affect me. I think sometimes it's given me a greater self-esteem, because I think, well, you can't make everyone happy, so you might as well just be happy with yourself. But then there are days when it really does get to me, and lately the thing seems to be my accent. So, Australian accent, a lot of people apparently don't like listening to it. It makes their ears bleed, or one guy said he has nightmares by the way I say film noir. So yeah, another one says they always fast forward me when I come on Turner Classic Movies, but then mention something that I had said. So obviously did not fast forward me at all and was listening the entire time. But I started thinking, well, I want people to be able to understand me, because I work so hard on these intros. I write all the scripts myself, I delve into the research, and so I've started to try to pronounce my R's, which is really hard for me to do. It doesn't sound natural at all. And of course, just my luck on Turner Classic Movies, I get both Mother's Day and Father's Day. So if you tune into TCM on those days, you'll hear me sounding like a pirate. But it's not just me. You know, I was talking to Hugh Jackman, just a name drop, a couple of months ago, and he was saying his very first film where he had to do an American accent, he had to say, "Where is the murderer?" He said that was so hard to say. I was like, I hear you. So it's always that delicate balance. And what I've realized of being a woman on camera for so long, that 90% of what you receive is about what you look like and what you sound like, and only about 10% of what you're actually saying. So people will always comment on what I am wearing, but not so much like the content that I'm there to deliver. And I think that's true for women, you know, across the board. And it's because we've been conditioned to see women in certain ways, thanks to all the images that we're presented through the media, through advertising, and through movies. And something that I've really had to grapple with the last couple of years was what kind of damage my love of film may have done to my own self-esteem. You know, it's given me so much. It's inspired me, gave me this career, it gave me the impetus to move countries. It gave me an escape from some really tough times, but at the same time, just seeing a wealth of images that show women as where the beauty ideal is so narrow, where you can't help comparing yourself to what you see on screen, where the female characters have no agency. They're there to be love interests or sexual objects, to be the cheerleaders for the male characters, and they're not there to have their own story and be their own hero. And it really does start to seep in after a while. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard about the term the male gaze, which was coined by the great film theorist Laura Mulvey in 1975 to talk about what happens to all of us when we see most of our celebrated art coming through a male perspective. And in films, the camera lens itself seems to take on this view. So you'll see the various lighting choices, the editing, and the camera angles used often mirroring what the male character is seeing. So I have a really crude example of this, but it is, hold on, let me fix my slides. It is from the wonderful film, I might have to get up in the big, here we go. So press play on this one. It's from the wonderful film Transformers, just a very basic example.
listen, I was wondering if I could ride you home. Give you a ride home in my car to your house.
So I don't know if you could hear that, but he said, "Can I ride you home? Give you a ride home." But anyway, Megan Fox's character, she's good with cars. She's better with cars than he is, but as you'll see, the camera just mirrors exactly what Shia LaBeouf's character is seeing, which is looking at her body. You'll see this shot here in a moment that literally pans up her body. So of course what happens to all of us in the audience when we're watching a film like this is that it puts you in the mindset of this male character. So no matter what your gender, your sexual orientation may be, you are looking at Megan Fox in the same way that Shia LaBeouf is looking at Megan Fox. So this male gaze really gives male characters the position of power. They're the ones doing the looking, and the women are the ones being looked at in a much more passive position. And this also happens in movie marketing. If we can go to the next slide, okay, it's a very crude example. So this is a selection of movie posters from a great website called The Headless Women of Hollywood. And it collects together all these examples of how often this happens in movie marketing, which is where you don't see the face, or sometimes her head is cut off, often shot from behind. Sometimes you'll see male characters looking at her. Showgirls, you see a little bit of her face, but she's still cut off. And of course, what this tells us is that a woman's body is the most important thing, and not their face, their voices, their brains, and all the rest of it. And I've even had to deal with this in my own small way. So my first book, Backwards and in Heels, when it came to doing the audio version, it was sent to a different company to do it. And so it's not my publisher, but they sent back the cover of the audio version, and you can take a look at this. No head. She got no head. So, and I thought this is interesting because I talk about that website in my book. So I went back to them, I said, I'm sorry, I can't have this as the cover because it seems ironic that then I'm talking about it in the book. And so I just thought that was funny that even a feminist book has to deal with this same thing. But you know, as I was speaking about women in film, I always had this small sense in the back of my mind of like, well, maybe this has always been the case in Hollywood. Maybe it's just always been a boys' club and it will always continue to be a boys' club. And then one day, reading a film book, as I said I often do, I came across one quote which said, at the very beginning of American cinema, there were more women working as writers, directors, producers, owning their own studios than there has been since. And that really surprised me as someone who prides herself on her film knowledge, that I didn't know much about this. And I thought, who are these women? And I want to find out as much as I can. So I went down this whole research rabbit hole, going to the library, trying to find all the information I could. There's been some great work done in this area already, some great books like Silent Feminists by Anthony Slide, which came out in the 1970s. The Women Film Pioneers Project, and the AFI has just announced a big study into trying to find out exactly who these women were at the very beginning of American cinema. But it's really tough to find a lot of this information, and scholars estimate that there are hundreds of female innovators that are yet to be discovered about what level they've contributed to American cinema. So a lot of this is because, you know, film at this time wasn't thought of as being a culturally important medium. Films weren't saved in the same way they are. People didn't keep good records. So it can be hard to pin together exactly who was who, but there are some women that we definitely know about. So we'll go to the next slide. Alice Guy Blaché is the big one. So there's a great documentary that's coming out next week that I really recommend called Be Natural, and it is all about Alice Guy Blaché. She is not only the very first female filmmaker in history, but one of the first filmmakers, full stop. And it's so surprising how I didn't know anything about her, and I definitely would be one that should. So she was born in Paris, and she started working as a secretary at a photography business when she was 20, and when she was 23, she asked her boss if she could borrow one of his new motion picture cameras for the weekend. And in doing that, she ended up creating what many people say is one of the first, if not the first, narrative films in history. And that's this one. This is called The Cabbage Fairy. It's from 1896. And it has a very simple story. She's pulling babies quite harshly, I have to say. I feel sorry for these babies that are just being pulled out of cabbages, and real babies, popped on the ground. But anyway, this was really unique because up till this time, to show what the motion picture camera could do, it was often just people leaving work or people in daily situations, real life situations, and not an actual story. So Alice didn't consider this to be a masterpiece, but she said it gave her enough success that she was able to keep trying. And so then she went for the next 11 years. She directed every film out of the Gaumont Film Company. And then in 1910, she set up her own studio called Solac Studios in New Jersey. And if we go to the next slide, you can see some of the innovations that she did. She kept experimenting with her own filmmaking. Right at the top, you see hand-colored tinted film. So well before Technicolor came in, she was trying these things. She also made the oldest known film that has an all African American cast. And she also played around with split screen. She had this motto called Be Natural, which is what the documentary is titled, all about getting her actors to act in a much more natural way, which of course later we know is the method acting. But she was doing this back in the silent era when it was all the rage to be big and theatrical as an actress, as actors. And she also played around with synchronized sound well before the sound era. And she's really ahead of her time. One of my favorite films is this next one. It's called The Consequences of Feminism, which the title for 1906 is quite surprising. This is a comedy. It's set in a world where the gender roles are reversed. So here you see the guy is putting on makeup, he's getting himself ready. This is a hat company where the guys are sewing hats. And then when you go outside, you see the women are the ones that are quite sexually aggressive. So it's difficult to know if Alice was, trying to make a point about people being worried about feminism and women gaining more rights, or if she just thought it was quite funny to have the men acting like women and women act like men. So here is an all-female bar, and a guy comes in and he's very quickly thrown out the door. And it's really surprising to see for 1906 because I can't even imagine today, showing or having a film that's called anything to do with feminism. So the guy's with the baby, it goes on like that. So of course, most of her work, much like many of the silent filmmakers at the time, has been lost or disintegrated, it wasn't kept. So it's estimated that out of the thousands of films that she made, or over 1,000 films that she made, about 130 remain, although as you'll see if you see the documentary, more work is being done to rediscover her. So she is a pivotal pioneer, and while she was at her studio, she actually mentored a lot of young women, like this next woman, Lois Weber. So she was the most successful director, female director of the early 20th century. She focused on social issues, but she had really inventive visual techniques. So during her day, people would talk about her as being on par with someone like W.D. Griffith, as one of the very inventors of cinema language. And her movies made money too. In 1916, one of the top films in America was called Where Are My Children? And it was a short film about abortion and birth control, made by Lois Weber. So she really delved into some tough topics. She also made movies about poverty and drug abuse as well. And this is one of her most visually impressive films that I've been able to see. It's from 1913, it's called Suspense, co-directed with her husband. But you'll see in just a second this shot, the over-the-head shot. And this is really inventive for its time. So that, really surprising to see in 1913. And this is a thriller. It's about a woman who's played by Lois Weber. She's a mother. She is alone in the house, and a homeless guy finds a key under the mat and he lets himself in. And here is another really inventive shot, this superimposition of 3 different things happening all at once. So the homeless guy finding the key, the wife calling her husband, the husband in the middle there receiving the news. It's a really clever way of heightening tension and being able to show simultaneous action all happening at once. And that's just an example of the many different visual techniques that she tried. And Lois Weber, another woman who worked up until about the mid-1920s and then disappeared after that. So on the lighter side, my next woman I want to introduce you to is Mabel Normand. She was considered the first major comedian. She made 170 short films and 23 features. She was a big box office success. Her success rivaled her male contemporaries like Charlie Chaplin and Fatty Arbuckle. And she was fearless when it came to physical comedy. She was also very natural. She didn't have any theatrical training, so that actually gave her a great looseness and lightness about her acting. And she directed films as well, like this next film, which is called Mabel's Strange Predicament. And this is the very first time we see Charlie Chaplin playing his iconic character, Tramp. So that's her over there, Charlie Chaplin there. And so she's locked out and she's in her pajamas. And so many people say that Mabel Normand should get a little bit of credit for helping Charlie Chaplin discover this character of his, which became very iconic. She was great. She made a lot of films where she did stunts. She was the first girl that was ever tied to the railroad tracks. She sees another guy, she's got to hide. And she also performed a lot of the stunts herself. It's a very funny physical comedy, and also she mentored Charlie Chaplin. So she was 4 years younger than him, but by the time he came into the industry, she was already a veteran. And so later on, he said he learned everything about directing from Mabel Normand. She directed, she acted, she wrote, she produced films as well. And speaking of stunts, the next woman that I love is Helen Holmes. She's an example of one of the serial queens. So between 1910 and around 1920, there were those serials that played before the feature film, which were all about a character having these great adventures, and they would be episodic, and they would often have cliffhanger endings, like literal cliffhanger, someone would be hanging off a cliff. But some of the most popular were the female-led serials, and they had really great names. So there was The Exploits of Elaine, The Perils of Pauline, and The Hazards of Helen, which starred Helen Holmes. And this is an example of one of the Hazards of Helen episodes. And Helen ended up doing a lot of the stunts herself. I mean, she wanted to do everything. She couldn't do the most dangerous stuff, but she insisted on a lot of these stunts. So in The Hazards of Helen, she plays a railroad station telegraph operator who fights crime on the side. She directed a lot of the films herself. She wrote them as well, and because she insisted on doing a lot of these stunts, like wrestling men on top of a moving train. She would jump from burning buildings. She would gallop horses down rocky cliffs, jump into the water. And because she would do a lot of these stunts, there's some stories about some really scary moments she had, like once when the brakes failed on her truck as it was speeding down a hill. Another time her eye was punctured by cactus thorns. And there's an unconfirmed rumor that she severed her thumb while jumping from a galloping horse onto a moving train. But she loved it, and she said she wanted to write a lot of these stories because she said the male writers wouldn't give her dangerous enough stunts to perform. So one of her quotes was, if a photoplay actress wants to achieve real thrills, then she has to write them into the scenario herself. So that is what she did. Of course, there were many opportunities for women at this time, and it was much harder for women of color, but there were a few that were able to make their mark, like Marion E. Wong. And she was the first Chinese-American filmmaker who set up her own studio called the Mandarin Film Company. And she only made one film. It was this one called The Curse of Quan Guan from 1916, which she directed, wrote, produced, acted in, and also did the costumes. And this is the first film to feature an all Chinese-American cast. And it's a really interesting film, and it's got a lot of modern techniques in there as well. So, you know, in the early part of American cinema, there were a lot of opportunities for women. In fact, there were many roles in the crew that were thought to be particularly feminine, like, for example, film cutting, which became film editing. That was because it resembled sewing. It was thought to be kind of a good opportunity for women. There was even a whole section in a book about viable careers for women that talked about film directing and talked about how that was a great job for women. and talked about the various qualities that are good for directing that are considered to be quite feminine, with communication and bringing people together, multi-skilling, those kind of things. But from the mid-1920s, women started to be pushed out, and the change was so great that in the 1930s only one female director was working in Hollywood. And another example of how quick this change happened, for Universal Studios, which used to boast about their roster of film directors, they even had Universal City where Lois Weber was the mayor. They had about 11 film directors who were on staff making a bulk of movies, but then from the mid-1920s all the way up to 1982, they didn't hire a single female director. So what happened? Basically money. I mean, it's nuanced more than that, but a lot to do with money. At this time, of course, it was the Great Depression. So Hollywood suffered, but it survived by changing the way it made films, namely getting financing from banks rather than getting financing themselves. And of course, when the banks came to town, they felt much more comfortable giving large amounts of money to men rather than to women. Also, with the Great Depression, it wiped out a lot of the independently run studios. Many of those were run by women. And at the same time, the sound era was coming, and a lot of filmmakers, male and female, struggled to make that transition from silent films to sound, this new technology. And also, the studios started to have this more corporate structure. So they brought in executives to oversee everything, to oversee the money, and of course those executives were men, and then they would hire their friends, their fellow men, cousins, whatever, and it became this boys club. So when all the dust settled, 8 studios ended up with the most amount of power, and they were all run by men except for United Artists, which still had Mary Pickford as one of the founders among the other actors. And so this is the only female director who was working in the 1930s. Her name, if we go to the next slide, her name is Dorothy Arzner. And I love Dorothy. I mean, look at her there. She's such a boss. She's awesome. And she wore suits. She made commercial hits. She was able to make the transition to sound. In fact, she invented the boom microphone. In one of her early sound films, The Wild Party, she noticed how Clara Bow wasn't able to move freely. I mean, you may remember that scene in Singing in the Rain, where they have to hide the microphone somewhere, either in the costumes or in the sets. And so you would have a lot of actors awkwardly standing around a chair and talking into it, because that's where the microphone was held. And so she decided to put the microphone on the end of a fishing rod, and then get a crew member to hold it above Clara as she walked around. And so that became the boom microphone. And her work is wonderful because it's like a treasure trove of feminism at this time. She really made films that were focused on the complexities of women and their relationships, and not just romantic relationships, but female friendships as well. My favorite film of hers is called Dance Girl Dance. It's probably her most famous. It's from 1940, and it stars Lucille Ball and Maureen O'Hara. And they play these 2 dancers, Bubbles and Judy, and they're complete opposites. Bubbles, played by Lucille Ball, she has a special oomph. She doesn't mind, selling herself. She's very sexual. She's proud of it. Judy, played by Maureen O'Hara, is very pure. She loves ballet and she just wants to be a good dancer. So when Bubbles gets to do this burlesque show, she hires Judy to be her stooge. So Judy will go out on stage and perform ballet. She'll get the audience riled up and yelling because they just want to see some burlesque. And then Bubbles comes out to save the day. So I wanted to show you a clip from the film. This is when Judy has had enough of the yelling and she decides to confront the crowd. But take a look at the kind of camera angles that are used on Judy as she talks to the audience. Have a look.
ahead and stare. I'm not ashamed. Go on, laugh. Get your money's worth. Nobody's going to hurt you. I know you want me to tear my clothes off so as you can look your 50 cents worth. 50 cents for the privilege of staring at a girl the way your wives won't let you. What do you suppose we'd think of you up here? With your silly smirks your mothers would be ashamed of. And we know it's the thing of the moment for the dress suits to come and laugh at us too. We'd laugh right back at the lot of you, only we're paid to let you sit there and roll your eyes and make your screamingly clever remarks. What's it for? So as you can go home when the show's over and strut before your wives and sweethearts and play at being the strongest sex for a minute? I'm sure they see through you just like we do.
Even he likes it. That gives me chills. I don't know about you, but I feel like it's such a powerful moment, and the way that Judy is shot, where she's looking down at the audience, it's like she's saying that we are complicit in this as well, the movie audience, that we have been judging women on screen the same as her. I love that film. It didn't do very well when it first came out, but it was reassessed in the 1970s as female film critics started to rise and people started to discover Dorothy Asner and second wave feminism. And so it became a well-known film, but this was her last film as a director. She ended up teaching film at UCLA, and where she mentored a young student called Francis Ford Coppola. And then in 1975, she was inducted as the first woman into the Directors Guild of America. And I love the telegram that Katharine Hepburn, who she worked with a lot, sent to her, which said, isn't it wonderful that you've had such a great career when you had no right to have a career at all? Also in the 1930s, something big that happened in film was the introduction of the production code. You know, movies were starting to get very risque. It was all about violence and sex, and they were really pushing the boundaries. And a lot of moral groups didn't like this, so they wanted to enforce the censorship. And when the production code came in, I mean, it forbade anything fun, even open mouth kisses were out the door. And a lot of this hurt people of color especially, and women. And, you know, just before the code was enforced, there's a great moment that we call pre-code, which I don't know if you've had a chance, I'm sure you have, to see a pre-code movie, but it is so delightful in its raciness. I mean, these were films that talked openly about sex, that had a lot of violence, and for women it actually offered some interesting roles where they got to be in charge of their own sexuality. And one woman that's a perfect example of this pre-code movement is Mae West. Mae West, sassy broad. You know, she was an actress, a playwright, and she was unafraid of being a sex symbol. So one of her first plays, or if not the first play that she had, was just called Sex. And she went with that title because she knew it would provoke audiences to come and see it, and it would provoke the press to talk about it as well. It ran for 400 performances before it got raided by the police, and Mae West and her castmates were charged for indecency. And when she was in court talking about this, the judge asked if she was trying to be in contempt of court, and she said, "No, Your Honor, I'm doing my best to conceal it." And that's what I love about Mae West, is that she was such a wit. She had such a great way with words. So in 1932, Paramount bought one of her plays called Diamond Lil, which became She'd Done Him Wrong, and she chose a young Cary Grant to co-star with her. And I love the scene I'm about to show you, because it shows not only her great wit, it shows how aggressive she could be on camera, how in charge of her own sexuality she was, and also has a very famous line that I'm sure you'll all recognize. Take a look.
Thanks.
Ain't having much luck, are you?
Oh, but I'd have a great deal more if Doheny and the others would cooperate.
Ain't none of them worth saving. You hang around them long enough, you'll get that way yourself.
Well, thanks for the kind interest.
You know, I always did like a man in a uniform. And that one fits you grand. Why don't you come up sometime, see me? I'm home every evening.
Yeah, but I'm busy every evening.
Busy? So what are you trying to do, insult me?
No, not at all. I'm just busy, that's all. You see, we're holding meetings in Jacobson's Hall every evening. Anytime you have a moment to spare, I'll be glad to have you drop in. You're more than welcome.
I heard you. But you ain't kidding me any. You know, I met your kind before. Why don't you come up sometime, huh?
Well,
Don't be afraid, I won't tell.
But,
Come up, I'll tell your fortune. Ah, you can be had.
I love that look she gives at the end, just that little side eye. As I said, when the production code was enforced, it hurt a lot of actors like Mae West because it's a watered down, pale imitation of Mae West wasn't as popular with audiences and did a disservice to her great work and her words. But especially for people of color, you know, these rules, especially outlawing interracial relationships, I mean, that made it difficult to get any kind of lead role because with most of the movies being about love, a white actor would be cast as a lead, and of course then you couldn't have a person of color opposite them. So they were relegated to a lot of subservient roles. But you know, you had some great inspiration examples like Hattie McDaniel, who was of course in Gone with the Wind. And she was someone who was only given small opportunities in Hollywood, but to me, every time I see Hattie McDaniel on screen, my eye goes to her. And I feel like that was kind of her small rebellion, that she was able to make a lot out of the little that she was given. As she famously said, she would rather make $700 a week playing a maid than being one, because during her career, she faced a lot of criticism about the roles that she took. But with Gone with the Wind, she became the first black person ever to be nominated for an Oscar, and then she went on to win. And even just getting to that ceremony was a fight. You know, David O. Selznick had to campaign for her to even attend because it was being held at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, which had a segregation policy. And when she was allowed to attend, she had to sit at a different table away from all her Gone with the Wind castmates. But she was inspiring in what she was able to do with the small amount that she was given. So, you know, on screen, with the code being enforced, with the contracts that these stars were under, which had these strict moral clauses about what they could and couldn't do on and off screen, with the casting couch, which was rampant. I mean, you know, moguls like Weinstein have existed throughout Hollywood history, and with messages in movies just being basically about women getting married and finding love, it was quite restrictive for women on screen. But there is also an interesting argument to be had that roles at this time for women in what they called the women's pictures were actually better and more interesting than some of the roles we see actresses get today. Because these women's pictures were built entirely around these stars. They were star vehicles. They were all about women. Women were in charge of their own story. It was told from their perspective. And Janine Basinger wrote a great book called A Women's View, and she says how with these women's pictures, in order to show at the end that they need to choose love and make it a dramatic choice, they ended up showing women doing amazingly independent things just to make that choice very dramatic. So women in the audience got to go and see the women flying planes and being newspaper reporters, and even though they sometimes negated that power right at the end, it still didn't lose its impact. So one of my favorites are up here, a couple of them. Mildred Pierce with Joan Crawford, who playing a working mother. You've got the women up the top there, which had an all-female cast. Apparently even the animals were female too in that movie. And Betty Davis in Now Voyager as a woman who escapes her controlling mother to really find her true self. So these were really inspiring films to see. And then there's this great subset that also happened in the 1940s, which were the women's war movies. So this was all to encourage women to do their bit for the war effort. But you ended up seeing all these messages in movies showing that women were just as capable as men, and seeing them being the heroes of these stories. So Keep Your Powder Dry on the left here is about the Women's Army Corps. And then you have Cry Havoc up the top, which also has an all-female cast. and it's about nurses stationed in the Philippines waiting out a Japanese attack. And then down the bottom you have So Proudly We Hail, which is my personal favourite out of these. So right at the end of So Proudly We Hail, Veronica Lake's character realises that they're surrounded and there's no way out from the enemy. So she shakes out her long blonde hair from her helmet, she takes a single pin out of a grenade and walks directly into the opposing battalion to save the rest of her group, and that is always such a powerful image to me, and I love that. Another way that actresses had a small chance to play complex characters was in the film noirs. You know, film noir, of course, was a very masculine genre, but you had these women who were powerful sexual beings. You know, they were the femme fatales, the ones that tricked these poor men into dangerous situations and doing dark things like murder. And of course, at the end, the femme fatales are always punished for their crimes. They often died at the end of the stories, but it's really fun to see some of these women go really bad. So my favourite film noir is actually a very unusual film noir in that it's a Technicolor film noir. It's from 1945 called Leave Her to Heaven, starring Jean Tierney. And she plays a very possessive wife. She wants complete control and complete access to her husband. She doesn't even like it when his disabled brother Danny comes to stay. So this will be the next clip. These guys are working hard in the booth, by the way. Thank you for your help. So I wanted to show you a clip from the movie Leave Her to Heaven before I get to this one. And so this clip is her taking Danny out to the lake to swim, and Danny wants to show that he can swim a far distance, and it ends up going quite badly. Take a look.
Think you can make it, Danny? Oh, it's a fit. Don't worry about your direction. I'll keep you on your course. Okay. Are we halfway to the point yet? Not yet. You're not making very much progress, Danny. Are you all right?
I'm a little winded. I had a kick in my side, but it's gone now.
Let it float for a while.
Yeah. I think I'm getting tired.
Take it easy. You don't want to give up when you've come so far.
Okay. I'll get my second wind in a minute. Water's colder than I thought. I ate too much lunch. I got stomachache. It's a cramp. Alan, it's a cramp. Alan, help me.
Poor Danny. I feel so sorry for Danny. And there's something so disturbing about watching a Technicolor film noir because of the way it's all happening in broad daylight and in bright colours. And we've been trained to think of these great like MGM musicals with great Technicolor, and here you have something really disturbing happening, but Jean Tierney just gives a wonderful performance, and it's really layered. I mean, she's got a lot going on. So we saw briefly, but the next film I wanted to show you a clip of is called The Hitchhiker. So film noirs were a very masculine genre, and men directed them, except for this one. This was directed by Ida Lupino in 1953. And the premise is these two men pick up this murderous hitchhiker, and as you can see, it's shot very claustrophobic. Like it's all, a lot of it takes place inside the car, and they have very tight shots on the faces of the men, so it feels like there is no escape. It's full of tension. And at the time she made this movie, she was the only female director working in Hollywood. And it's got an all-male cast, pretty much. I mean, there's not much in the way of female characters. There's definitely no femme fatale. It was an all-male crew as well. And Ida Lupino, she came from a family of entertainers in England. She came over into Hollywood in the 1930s, and she struggled to find roles that were substantial. She was initially styled into being this Jean Harlow-esque teenage sex pot, and she worked really hard to campaign for better roles. In the 1940s, she started getting those chances with films like High Sierra and another film noir that I love called Roadhouse. But she wanted to direct, so she watched her directors on set to try to learn from them. In the late 1940s, her and her husband started a production company, and on their first film called Not Wanted in 1949, the director suffered from heart problems, and so she ended up taking over as director. And then she made a couple of films about women's issues before she went to these fast-paced thrillers like The Hitchhiker, which was her most successful movie. So it was pretty dire for female directors in Hollywood until about the 1970s, where suddenly you had the birth of New Hollywood. The Hays Production Code was abolished, and you had the rise of independent cinema. So the next slide shows you some examples of some great women that worked during this time. So between 1967 and 1980, it's estimated there were 16 female directors who made at least one narrative film with the studio or independently. And there you see Claudia Weil on the left there, made a great film called Girlfriends. Elaine May is the top right, and Joan Micklin Silver is down the bottom here. But of course, the directors that became the most famous during the birth of New Hollywood were all these men, these brilliant men, like Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola and Brian De Palma, Peter Bogdanovich, and they, with a few exceptions, made a lot of films about men, so the female roles were wives or love interests. For women of colour, female directors, continues to be difficult until about the 1980s and 1990s, with the further rise of independent cinema. And some women who really made their mark include Mira Nair, on the left there, Julie Dash up the top. She was the first black female director to have a film in wide theatrical release with Daughters of the Dust. And Cheryl Dunye, bottom right, who was a really pivotal voice in the new queer cinema movement. And this is what it looks like in Hollywood today. So I've got some facts here from the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, where Dr. Stacey L. Smith and her team work really hard to get the real data and the figures behind the gender inequality happening in Hollywood. So they looked at the 1,200 popular films between 2007 and 2018, and they found that just 4% were directed by women, 96% by men. This is a statistic that hasn't changed, and it's stayed like that for a very long time. And out of the 1,335 directors, they found that men outnumbered the women 22-1. And really importantly, they found that there is this pipeline problem. So there's a huge drop-off between the women who make an independent feature and women who make a studio feature. So what that tells us is that women can get together financing, they can make an independent film, but once it comes to them asking for money to get more financing or to go to studios, that's where we see women drop off. And over the decade of this study, there was just 46 individual female directors. Some were repeats and made studio movies. And of these, 5 were African American and 2 were Asian or Asian American. So as you can imagine, writing my first book, Backwards and Heels, was kind of a frustrating experience. I thought that my final chapter was just going to be all caps and yelling, like nothing has changed. Because when you step back at it and you look at the history as a whole, you see all the peaks and troughs. You see the moments when it looked like things were getting more equal and then when it went back to normal. I spoke to Gina Davis and she talked about after she made Thelma and Louise, everyone was saying, well, this changes everything. Now we're going to have so many female buddy movies, and that didn't happen. And same with A League of Their Own. This changes everything. Now we're going to have so many female sports films, and that didn't really happen. But, and also when I first released my book, it was August of 2017, and because it's a small publisher, I had to do my own marketing, so I couldn't get anyone interested. No one wanted to talk about this topic. I was told it was very negative, that it was kind of boring, and that it wasn't relevant to today. And then, just a few months later, October 2017, the allegations about Harvey Weinstein came out. The Me Too movements and Time's Up started to come to the forefront, and suddenly everybody wanted to talk about it, which was so exciting. So I feel like for the first time I have real optimism about the future of Hollywood and how things could actually be different. And that led to me writing my second book, The Female Gaze, which was a really fun experience because I could just delve into watching a whole variety of movies made by women. And what I found by just going straight into watching all these movies made by different women from all over the world, featuring women of all kinds and also movies made by women about men, is that I discovered that my own self-esteem seemed to improve. I loved seeing women that I related to or women I didn't know about and wanted to learn more about. I think it's really important that we have a variety of people telling a variety of stories. I also found that the way stories were told felt different. And so I wanted to show you, as one of my last clips, an example of one of the movies that's in my book, The Female Gaze, which I love. It's called Real Women Have Curves, and it's by Patricia Cardoso. So this stars America Ferrera as a first-generation Mexican-American who is finding her own identity. She works with her mother in a sweatshop, literally a sweatshop, because they're always sweating, it's so hot. They're making dresses, which they sell cheaply, and then the department stores raise the prices on them. And one day she decides that she's had enough, she's too hot, and she needs to figure out a way to cool down. So have a look at this.
Only 18?
Such a relief, we're almost done with this.
Anna, what are you doing?
Hi, Mama, come on. It's so hot. All the steam has me sweating like a pig.
Well, we're sweating too, but we're not taking our clothes off.
Why not? We're all women, Mom. We all have the same things.
Anna, póntela.
Estella, Rosalie, Pancha, please. Aren't you hot in those clothes? I feel so sticky.
Aren't you embarrassed?
Of what?
Look at you look awful.
Mama, I happen to like myself.
Right on, sister.
Y tú? The two of you should lose weight. You would look beautiful without all that fat.
Ay, Doña Carmen, Ana and Estela are beautiful. They look good the way they are.
Thank you, Pancha.
Thank you, Pancha.
Aren't you ashamed?
Mama, you look just like us.
Yes, but I'm married.
Oh, so that's it. Make myself attractive so that I can catch a man.
Ana, listen to her. Learn now or you'll end up like Estela.
Mama, I do want to lose weight. But part of me doesn't because my weight says to everybody, fuck you.
Ave Maria, pero qué boca.
How dare anybody try to tell me what I should look like or what I should be when there's so much more to me than just my weight?
What's wrong with wanting to be thin and sexy?
Rosalie, you don't get it.
Well, I want to be taken seriously, respected for what I think, not for how I look.
Exactly, thank you.
What if you don't think anything?
Ay, Rosalie.
Ay, I look like a cow.
Rosalie, shut up. Stand up. Now look at yourself. If you're a cow, then I'm a hippo.
And I'm an elephant.
And I'm Orca. Ay, Rosalie, you are so skinny in comparison to all of us.
No, I'm not. Look at my fat hips. And my cellulite.
You want to see cellulite? All right, here we go. Not that cellulite, this cellulite.
Yes. Excuse me, ladies. Estela! This is cellulite.
That's not that bad.
Tiene nada.
Oh, you don't understand. I got all these stretch marks in my arms and chichis, look.
That's small, honey.
No.
You want stretch marks? There you go. Okay? I have stretch marks that go from north to south.
Ladies, let me show you stretch marks.
Pancha!
From east to west.
Jesus, she wins. Pero que se han vuelto locas.
Ladies, look how beautiful we are.
Y que bien se siente, ¿verdad? To be rid of all these clothes and just let it all hang out. Okay, ladies, we have work to do. Come on.
Who cares what we look like when no one's watching us?
Something I hardly get to see in movies, right? Body positivity. Real women, real bodies, and as you saw the way that they're shot, whole bodies, not just on various parts of bodies, no panning up and down, just as they are. And that's the point of everything that I wanted to talk about tonight, is that when you let more people share their stories, you get to experience worlds that you might relate to or you might not know anything about. You get to understand people that you may never have met. I really think that it creates empathy in getting to see and understand not only our differences, but how similar we all are too. And it also cuts down the narrow view of what a woman should look like and what they should sound like as well. It's frustrating to think about what kinds of stories we have missed out on by not allowing women to be involved in the cinematic process as much as they were at the very beginning of cinema. But I think it's so important to celebrate what we have and to talk about these early women of film and remember that Hollywood wasn't always a boys' club, so I don't see any reason that it has to continue. Thank you for listening.